If you had said, you know, there's going to come a point where the Arab states are going to be very interested in improving relations with Israel, no matter what they're doing in the West Bank, people again would have said, you have no understanding of Arab politics. But here we are. In terms of their aid levels, their political involvement, they are much more interested in good relations with Israel than good relations with the Palestinians.
Elliott Abrams, thank you so much for joining me. It's really a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
I don't need to brag about your credentials. You're a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, Deputy National Security Advisor in the Bush administration, handling the Middle East, and like a really long list, as long as my arm, of previous credentials. But we're actually here to talk a little bit about history and its impact on the present. It's the 50th anniversary, incredibly, of the Six-Day War coming up. Thinking back on it, to me, it seems like it was a real turning point for the Middle East, a turning point for the State of Israel and its relationship with the Arab world. But I'd love to hear how you see it.
Well, I think you're right. I think it was a turning point. First of all, Israel had survived 1948 and 1956. But 1967 was different. It was a huge victory. And it must have changed Arab attitudes. Yes, there was a 73 war as well. But still, this was the one where Israel said, not only are we here to stay, but we're capable of defeating all of you and expanding. And I think that was itself a turning point. And then Israel had all this territory and had to figure out what to do with it. Territory that it didn't get in 1948 in the West Bank and Jerusalem. And then some Syrian territory, some Egyptian territory that could be kept or negotiated. So I think it changed everyone's view, including the American view. There's an illusion that we were great allies, the U.S. and Israel, from 1948 on. It's not true. The real change is 67, where Lyndon Johnson and others say, wow, this country might be useful, could be an ally. And this is after 67 that we really begin to sell and give significant amounts of armaments to Israel.
Why were we not there for the State of Israel? Now, if you talk to any American politician, they'll say, since the beginning, we've stood by doughty little Israel. But as you say, that wasn't the case. It really was, it was 67 when Israel defined itself somehow militarily, national security-wise, in the mind's eye of the United States.
Yeah, I think, you know, if you go back, the State Department, the CIA, the establishment had really not been for the foundation of the State of Israel in 1948. George Marshall, Secretary of State then, had told Truman, not only had he told Truman, don't do it, he had told Truman, if you do it and should you run for re-election, I would not vote for you. It's pretty rough stuff. So the whole foreign policy defense establishment was against it and viewed Israel in the 40s, in the 50s, in the 60s as a terrible liability. We wanted to definitely keep our distance from them. After all, in 56, Suez campaigns, when Eisenhower had forced the British and the French and the Israelis to give up what they had gained. So we were just never really very close. The Israelis were getting their arms in the 50s, early 60s from the French more than anyone else. The notion that Israel was an asset, not a liability, is the 67 war for the American foreign policy establishment. Or maybe I should say half of it, because half of it probably still sees Israel as a liability. Maybe
not half. This is all of this evolution is something to unpack, and I've got a dozen interesting questions in my mind about this. Israel as an asset, Israel as a national security asset, really, as you say, sort of doesn't begin till then, and maybe it also evolves throughout this, after the 73 war, after the Yom Kippur War, and throughout the 70s. But there's also this Cold War backdrop to it, and was that a big part of the change in attitudes as well?
I think it was, because we're talking about a period when the Russians are our concern in the Middle East. And the Russians have a relationship with Egypt. And the Russians are really all over Egypt until Sadat finally throws them out. So there was this fear, and this does go back again to the 40s. The closer we come to Israel, the more opening we give the Soviets to move in. And there was probably some truth to it because the level of enmity between all the Arab states and Israel in those days was exceptional. What we're seeing now in this decade is really quite new. So yeah, I would say you're absolutely right. The Cold War and the fear that friendliness with Israel opens opportunities for the Soviets is a big deal.
So let's talk about the Palestinians and this territory that the Israelis gain in 1967. In the vernacular of Middle East studies, and that's a bit of an inside joke for anybody who's watching, in the vernacular of the Middle East studies, Israel had a claim to legitimacy within its 67 borders. It was created by a United Nations resolution. Yes, of course, there was all this conflict. The Arabs didn't like it. But at the end of the day, this was a country. It only had half of Jerusalem, and Arab states occupied the West Bank, Gaza, half of Jerusalem. All of a sudden, here's Israel, basically as we know Israel now in many ways, except for, well, I guess Gaza comes later. And yet, the narrative of the Palestinians has been rewritten in many ways to begin then. But it didn't start then. It started before the Six-Day War. Talk a little bit about how you see the evolution and how the Six-Day War has become this iconic event for the Palestinian.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I mean, the West Bank is owned, controlled by Jordan after 1948 until the 67 war. Okay. Who in those years is saying, well, what about the Palestinians? What about Palestinian freedom? What about Palestinian statehood and sovereignty? No one. No one. The Palestinians are talking about it a bit, but not getting any attention on the world stage. Everybody seems to be happy with King Hussein controlling the West Bank. The real Palestinian nationalism that we know today starts in 67 with, quote, the occupation. It's sort of interesting because the term occupation starts in 67. The place was controlled by Jordan. How about the Jordanian occupation?
Right.
Never. It's a phrase that doesn't exist. I haven't Googled it, but I bet it doesn't even exist on Google. So what starts is, of course, the problem. The problem starts in 67. It's the Jews who are now occupying the West Bank and who are controlling the Palestinians, dominating the Palestinians. This cannot be tolerated. It really starts in 67, and you get the rise of Arafat, of Fatah, of the PLO. Not that they didn't exist, but their rise on the world stage to becoming, as you've said, a cause and a reason to delegitimize Israel. This is the June War in 1967.
The PLO is created in the early 60s. They get no traction. Is it early on? What works for the Palestinians? Is it the West Bank? Is it Jerusalem? I don't actually know the answer to this question.
Well, from 48 to 67, I think it's fair to say nothing really works for the Palestinians.
Right.
Starting then, you know, what's funny about it is if you actually go back to then, there's an era of good feeling for Israelis and Palestinians. Go back to, let's say, the fall of 1967 or go back to 1968. There's no border between the West Bank and Israel. Israelis go shop in the West Bank. Palestinians who want to go to the beach just get in their car and drive to the beach. It's terrorism that creates the border, really. So I think all of this is frankly, a sign that the legitimacy of Israel had never been accepted. The problem was the Arab states and the Palestinians didn't really know how to make an argument, let's say in 1965, that the world was particularly interested in. Now, after the 67 war, they have an argument. They have an argument about the Golan, the Sinai, which I would say most countries would have said, well, clearly Israel has to give them back. And they have an argument about the West Bank. What happens to it? Does it go back to Jordan? Does it become an independent entity? I mean, surely the Israeli domination is unsustainable. And this at a time when it looks quite sustainable because people are having, a decent experience. There is no border.
This is very interesting, actually, because all of a sudden the Israelis have this enlarged. Israel prior to 1967 has this Arab population, Arab Israelis, and we think of them, as Arab Israelis. And then all of a sudden Israel has nominal sovereignty over this huge additional population. First of all, we never talked then about the demographic time bomb, which some frankly, on both sides of the conflict like to talk about. But in addition, suddenly this not very old government has to grapple with this question. And it's interesting because, of course, the Labour Party, the left, is in charge not too many years afterwards and makes a lot of decisions that have been very formative for the Israeli-Palestinian relationship. How does this happen?
Well, the left is in charge. I mean, the left takes charge of Israel in 1948 and basically keeps it for decades until Menachem Begin. So they're in charge at this point. I think Israelis thought, well, there aren't too many people on the Golan, and the Golan Heights are the place from which the Syrian army is constantly shooting down at Israel. Okay, that's not a demographic problem. I think most Israelis believe that ultimately Sinai would go back to Egypt. I mean, Sinai is bigger than Israel, and
a lot of sand.
A little bit of oil.
Yes.
And they were pumping some of that oil. Not too much population, but the notion that Israel would keep it forever, I think, was not prominent, and partly because it has no famous religious sites. This is not the West Bank from that point of view. But the West Bank and Jerusalem, now you're talking about significant Palestinian populations and very significant religious sites. Start with the most significant religious site, the Western Wall of the Temple, but then you've got places like Hebron, that are prominent in the Bible, and all of a sudden they're under Israeli-Jewish control. And there are lots of Israelis who, I think, from the very beginning, think this is biblical. This is.
Let me interrupt you for a second, though. Is that right? I have to say, when I think back on the Israel of, people talk about the post-Zionist Israel. When I think about post-independence Zionist Israel, I don't think of it as a heavily religious thinking, religiously influenced state, and certainly not the government, which is explicitly in many ways anti-religious.
Yep.
So, do you think that that's really as formative?
Well, I do. I want to go back to one thing you said before because it's worth emphasizing. Israel in 1967 is 19 years old. This is like the U.S. in 1808, if I've got my math right. I mean, it's really early, and they're just getting started. And what did they do in the early years? They fended off wars, and they settled large numbers of Jewish refugees coming from Europe and then North Africa. So this is a young state, young government, and you're absolutely right. Ben-Gurion, who's the dominant figure, Labour Party, which is the dominant party, militantly secular. But when 67 comes and they capture Jerusalem, I'm not saying that the Labour Party people all of a sudden became Orthodox Jews, but there were lots of Orthodox Jews, and they saw this as basically the fulfillment of biblical prophecies. There are iconic photos, truly, it's an overused word, but truly iconic of, 19-year-old Israeli paratroopers staring up at the Western Wall.
I remember this.
They're not wearing religious gear. They're military gear. They just captured it. But this is when a lot of religious Jews say this was meant to happen. God meant this to happen. God gave us this land, and we must settle it. So the beginning of the settlements, 1967, we now have Hebron and all these other places that are famous in the Bible. We need to be there. We need to settle them. There is a piece of this that is secular. Let's call it the Sharon piece. We need to settle the heights because those are of considerable military value. And we need to settle the places from which Jews were driven murderously in the past. And Hebron is an example of this, where there was a famous massacre in 1929. Jews were driven out, so there were no Jews there in 1967. That's a reason to go back. Same thing in Jerusalem. There are areas around Jerusalem from which Jews were driven in the 48 war with quite a significant amount of slaughter. We need to go back to those, is the kind of Sharon message. It's a military, security, nationalist, but not religious message.
Right.
But there is a religious side to this too, a sense of prophecy fulfilled.
And yet now, if we talk about this, I would say that the two threads that you pulled on post-1967 dominate not just the Arab world's thinking, not just the Western world's thinking, but a lot of Israelis thinking about the territories gained after 1967. Settlement, religious manifest destiny, and of course the vital importance of Jerusalem, which even anti-religious, even secular Israelis will say, well, I mean, of course we have to give everything back, but not that.
Yeah.
So let's talk about, we talk about the run-up, we talk about the formative nature of the Six-Day War, and we need to come back and talk about the war itself as well. But understanding that neither of us are military experts, and I'm betting you're more of a military expert than I am. But in the decades since, we see the rise of the settler movement. We see their growing importance in the Israeli body politic. We see the changing of what are fondly called facts on the ground. Not just places like Ma'ale Adumim, which are the suburbs of Jerusalem and arguably are this sort of Sharon's commanding heights of Jerusalem, but places like Ariel, which are on the Green Line, the border between Israel and the West Bank. What should we think about how this has impacted the evolution of the Israeli-Palestinian issue and the conflict, and how it's changed Israel?
Well, one of the things that has changed Israel that I think people weren't thinking about much in '67 is the Orthodox population.
Right.
And that's Jewish demography. That is to say, secular Israelis have more children than Americans do. Let's say 3, whereas we're at about 2.1. But the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox have 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 children. So if you look at the numbers now, they form a significant block, and it keeps getting bigger in the sense that the number of children, let's say under the age of 5 in Orthodox families, is quite significant. So Israel is changing in that way, and that affects not how they view the Golan, not how they view Sinai, but yes, how they view Jerusalem and the West Bank. So that's an Israeli political fact. Add to that you have the settlers. And this, again, this starts under labor. This is not a phenomenon of the right wing, of Begin, of Sharon.
No, in fact, it was Shimon Peres was intimately involved in the beginning of the settlement movement as an explicit political effort to sort of integrate and to be part of the West Bank.
In fact, if you go back to Peres and Rabin, the leaders of the Labor Party, they're pro-settler. Everybody's pro-settler.
Right.
Now what's happened is, of course, the line just keeps rising. The number of settlers. I do think there is still, though, a separation between the large settlements, which tend to be west of that security barrier, and the settlements in the middle of nowhere, because at least secular Israelis and a lot of religious Israelis think that, people who live in a settlement of 117 people in the middle of 1 million Palestinians are fanatics. Whereas the ones who live, as you said, in Ma'ale Adumim, population 38,000, 10 minutes from Jerusalem, those are suburbanites. They're like you and me. So that division still exists. But this issue has become almost the only issue. If you talk to Europeans about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what are we talking about? Settlements. One of the aspects of this that is really not looked at, I think, is let's call it the development of Palestinian political culture after 1967, because it actually flourishes. The Jordanian hand, 48 to 67, is very tough. King Hussein, whom everybody loves now, was a dictator. I mean, there's no democracy about this in Jordan. He ran the place. And he ran the West Bank, and he ran it more with let's say, greater oversight. So when the Israelis take over, things open up. How do you judge this? Take a look at NGOs, civil society, community associations, bar associations, all sorts. Hundreds and hundreds get created. So for 2 decades, really, there's a significant growth in Palestinian society. They are very much affected by this partial integration with a democracy called Israel. And they learn something for the first time. What's freedom of speech? What are free trade unions? What's freedom of the press? They had none of that under Jordan. What's the ability to go out and form a club that has political overtones? Fine, do it. This is a Palestine that a lot of Israelis think can someday develop into an independent, democratic state.
This is the post-67, pre-First Intifada.
Exactly.
So it's basically the 70s, if you want to, with a little overlap on either side.
Yep.
This is right, and
yep.
I remember this. I remember this Palestine well. I worked in Jerusalem in the early 1980s, and that's absolutely right. Salons, figures who had deep roots, unlike the PLO, had deep roots in the West Bank and in Palestinian history, who were intellectual leaders as well as political leaders. There's no question that this was the case. We don't talk a lot about it. It's interesting.
No, I mean it's a different, and then it disappeared.
Well, is it without getting into Oslo and exciting vast amounts of hate mail for both of us, is it the Oslo and the legitimation of the PLO that ultimately brings an end to this Palestinian, I don't want to call it a flourishing because it's unfair,
right,
but certainly this moment?
I think so. I think it's the return of Arafat and the acceptance on the part of the Israelis, the Europeans, the Americans, that he could do what he wants with Palestine, because he's accepted as the legitimate and charismatic leader. And he just crushes all of this. He brings it to an end deliberately. The only flourishing under Arafat is his 13 security organizations that are all rivals of each other, which he does quite intelligently and deliberately. But this kind of societal flourishing is really choked off.
Well, so Arafat is the quintessential Arab leader. He's been in North Africa. He's been in Tunisia. He's had all of he's been feted from one Arab dictator capital to another, and this is where he learns his lessons. And in addition, his excellent balance of power management of internal politics. So he brings all of this, and the intolerance that comes with it. And as you say, it's not just the Europeans, the Arabs that are okay with this, it's also the Israelis who are okay with this. It has an impact on Palestinians economically as well. For those of us who were old enough, we remember that with the outflow of Palestinians that came not just after 1948 from Israel proper, but a lot of the outflow of Palestinians that came from the Israeli-occupied areas after 67, these made up the management classes of the Middle East. These were the leaders. These were the people who were in Kuwait. They ran the Gulf.
Yep.
Obviously, they were very prominent in Jordan, but also in Syria, in Lebanon, and this also starts to end at that point.
The crowning blow is when Arafat decides to back Saddam Hussein in the first Gulf War. Brilliant.
A fatal error. Right.
It really was, because it turned all of the Arab states against him.
Right.
They were all on the American side, except, well, no, I was going to say except Syria, but Hafez al-Assad was also on the American side.
Right.
So Arafat's isolated, and the way to punish him is to send all those people home.
Right.
And it's gigantic disaster, because they were, as you say, prospering all over the Arab world, more or less like the Lebanese. They were viewed as really tremendously talented people, and they sent a lot of money home, a lot of remittances, and all that ends, and they go home, many of them, because it's the only place they are accepted immediately, but there's no work. And in fact, the West Bank economy, isn't so terrible compared to some Arab states, I mean Yemen or poor states, but
that's a low bar.
I know, but the data is pretty poor.
Right.
But you're right about the point with respect to Israel, because over time they begin to see the West Bank as a security matter, almost exclusively. Now, who's going to keep the security for them? Who's the agent, if you will? And the answer to that, and it is Yitzhak Rabin's answer, is Arafat. And there's a crack he made that's very famous about how Arafat will rule without judges and courts and without human rights organizations. He will keep the peace in a fairly sordid deal with Israel.
A deeply cynical and amazingly Middle Eastern deal. And this is another interesting part of the conversation is, now, particularly as the sort of the worm turns once again with the rise of ISIS in the Middle East, and the Sunni powers become intensely focused on the negative power of Iran, and you have these shifts into blocks. You see suddenly the Israelis and the Sunnis together, the Palestinians just, by the wayside for everybody, not just for the Israelis, but for almost everybody as a matter of substance. And this is the sort of, this cynical deal in which, democracy, the rights of the Palestinians, who cares? Arafat will take care of this. And even then, Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, who is Arafat's successor, less charismatic, perhaps even less competent successor, is still part of this compact, for which, of course, the Palestinians pay the ultimate price. At the end of the day, Israel's done extraordinarily well since the '67 war. It is the Palestinians whose fortunes have risen to a certain extent, but then declined.
Well, I think that's right. I think they have suffered from terrible leadership, and I'm struck as we look at it from today. We think back to Valença and Havel and Mandela, and we see leadership matters. And they had Haj Amin al-Husseini in the 20s and 30s, the Mufti,
of Jerusalem.
who was pro-Hitler in World War II.
A big pet of Hitler's, too.
Then Yasser Arafat, who makes Palestinians synonymous with terrorism and crushes the, let's call it, embryonic civil society and democratic society they're building. And now you have Mahmoud Abbas, and he's not at all a charismatic leader, and today he's really not a very popular leader, but he's an increasingly tough leader because he's unpopular, and he doesn't want to go anywhere. So Palestinian society, again, has someone who's kind of squeezing the life out of it. I am struck that if you try to think back into 1967, if you had said, well, how long do you think Israel can actually keep all these territories? Most people would have said, well, we have to negotiate. This could be years. If you had said 50 years, people would have thought you were simply a fanatic or a lunatic. 50 years, the term unsustainable is now usually associated with Israel's occupation of the West Bank. Well, 50 years, it's really quite amazing. And if you had said, there's going to come a point where the Arab states are going to kind of turn away from this and be very interested in improving relations with Israel, no matter what they're doing in the West Bank, people again would have said, you have no understanding of Arab politics. But here we are with the Arabs, lip service, obviously, speeches and so forth. But in terms of their aid levels, their political involvement, they are much more interested in good relations with Israel than good relations with the Palestinians.
So a couple of exit questions, because we're running out of time. I'm having too much fun, I'm afraid. The Arabs have changed. I think we've touched that. It's not '67 that changes them. It's '67 that changes their appreciation of Israel's capacity. But that's not really the inflection point for the Arab world, is it? It's much more internal, much less about Israel. Or am I leading the witness?
It's '67 in the sense that they begin to think we have to deal with this entity. It's not going away. First, Egypt does. Then Jordan does, formally. So they're at peace. Hafez al-Assad negotiates a peace deal with Israel, on, off, doesn't make it in the end. But he wants to do the negotiating. And there's even some negotiating with Bashar al-Assad when Olmert is prime minister,
Right.
2007, 2008. And the Gulf Arabs now come around too. Here, I think it's time. Israel's remarkable economic success, and it's, of course, as you said at the beginning, it's Iran. It's the sense of having a really dangerous common enemy, because for all of these countries, they've kind of awakened to the fact Israel's not your enemy. You're an Emirati, you're a Saudi, you're a Kuwaiti. The only possible effect they have on you is that they might be good for your economy. So at least at the upper levels, at least at the elite and government levels, this is not an overnight change, but it is a steady change.
So my two exit questions. I keep amending this like Monty Python. But I think I have two exit questions. My one is the question of terrorism that we didn't touch on. We haven't talked about Hamas at all. And Hamas is not a non-issue, as is, obviously the Muslim Brotherhood exists. Hamas is very close to them, yeah. But this is not a thing 50 years ago. It has become very much a thing. More reflection, perhaps, on the transformation within the Palestinian world than about Israel. But we still do hear often the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and particularly the battle over the West Bank and Jerusalem, is the heart and the root of modern terrorism.
Right, we do hear that. I think it's nuts. I mean, we have a phenomenon here throughout the Islamic world, though much more in the Arab world than elsewhere. But it does extend. I mean, think of the Taliban, think of various groups. Think of the terrorist groups in Pakistan. Mm-hmm. This is not about Jerusalem. Bin Laden himself was really concerned with who rules Riyadh and Jeddah and Mecca and Medina, mm-hmm. much more than Jerusalem. Right. Iran is much more interested in who rules Mecca and Medina than who rules Jerusalem. So this argument is out there, but I think it's silly. I do think with respect to Hamas and Palestinian terrorism today, look, we have this phenomenon in the Islamic world. It would be very odd if you had terrorist groups throughout the Islamic world, except in one place. Only one place you didn't find any, the Palestinians. Mm. Which means, among other things, that it's going to be difficult. The Israelis and Palestinians might be able to work out a deal if they lived on an island.
Mm. Madagascar, maybe. Wait, no, that went out the window.
But they live in the middle of the Arab Middle East, in which there's a lot of terrorism and a lot of ideological and religious extremism. And that, I mean, there's no way of keeping that from affecting Palestinian Arabs. So it makes solving the Hamas problem infinitely harder.
Right. Well, the ill winds of the Middle East affect both the Israelis and the Palestinians. Okay, it's 50 years. 50 years from now. Oh. Let's embarrass ourselves. Don't worry, nobody will be watching video in 50 years. It'll be something much cooler. But let's pretend that somebody's caring. Where do we see this in our crystal ball?
Well, I think that if you could eliminate violence in the region entirely and create a Palestinian state in the West Bank, it would fail. It has no port, airport, currency, central bank, natural resources. So it seems to me that ultimately the West Bank is going to be in a form of confederation or association with somebody else. And it isn't going to be Denmark, it's going to be Israel or Jordan. And to me, the logic is Jordan because it is a Muslim Arab state. So I see in, 25 years, as little as 25 years, I see a Palestinian entity that, it's kind of like Austria-Hungary, one king, two prime ministers, maybe, two parliaments, maybe. And I do see them living at peace.
Well, that's an optimistic way to end. I'm a little bit surprised, but also delighted to hear that. So on that note, thank you so much for joining. This has been a really enjoyable conversation.
For me too. Thank you.
Good. Cheers. Thanks so much for watching this video on the Six-Day War at 50. Let us know what other topics you'd like AEI scholars to cover on Viewpoint, and be sure to check out the rest of our videos and research from AEI.